Hello and welcome back. Today I'd like to talk to you about religion in the ancient world, and in particular the cult of Dionysus. We haven't talked much about religion in this class because that deserves a class on its own. But today I want to talk to you about a cult that gets mentioned in your textbook, and one that's worth knowing about when we think about the religions that we're going to study later on in the course. So here is the story of Dionysus. If we're going to learn about Dionysus, we have to learn a little bit about how he came into the world. And that involves the myth of Europa. So here, in the city of Tyre, which is in modern-day Lebanon, lived a king, and he had a beautiful daughter named Europa. One day, this legendary king's daughter Europa was on the beach with her friends, and Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, flew over. Seeing her below, he became filled with lust for her. He decided to seduce her. And in order to do this, he transformed himself into a beautiful white bull, because that's how Zeus liked it, I guess. Zeus transforms himself into a bull and comes up to the beach where the young women are playing, including the princess. They are scared at first, but then he starts being playful around them, like a dog or something, and eventually convinces them to start playing with him in the water. And he gets a little further out into the water, and so far, in fact, that the Princess Europa has a hard time swimming because the water is up over her head. He lowers his neck as if to offer her a ride in the water. And when he does, she climbs onto his back. And then he swims off, abducting her, taking her far, far away. Here we see Zeus and Europa and him abducting her on this Byzantine ivory casket. How far does he take her? He swims all the way to Crete in our legend. There, Zeus has sex with Europa, and they have a child, King Minos, from which the Minoan civilization gets its name. There's more to the legend, though. She had a brother. His name was Cadmus, and he went looking for his missing sister. And he traveled through Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey, into Europe, down into what would become Thebes. And when he got to the place that would become Thebes, he encountered a water dragon. He killed the water dragon. And after he killed the water dragon, he was advised that he should plant the teeth of the dragon in the ground. So here Cadmus is sowing dragon's teeth in the ground. When he did this, soldiers grew out of the ground. And these soldiers were the first inhabitants of Thebes. Got all that? Well, while Cadmus never found his sister Europa, he did find a bride, Harmonia. And they had 4 daughters, Semele, Agawe, Autonoe, and Ino. And each of them had legendary children. But his first daughter, Semele, is the one we're interested in here today. She had an affair with Zeus as well. And that affair goes a little something like this. Semele had been having a torrid affair with Zeus for some time. Hera, the wife of Zeus, became angry about this and came to Semele in disguise. She pretended she was one of Semele's maids and said, "Semele, you know that man you're messing around with isn't really who he claims to be." And Semele said, "No, of course it's really Zeus." And Hera, pretending to be Semele's maid, said, "Well, if he's really Zeus, make him promise to come to you in all of his glory." And Semele said, "I'll do that." So that night, Semele and Zeus were in bed, and she said, "You promise you'll do anything for me?" He said, "I promise you anything." And he swore an oath on the river Styx, which is an unbreakable oath for the gods. So Semele said this, "Promise you'll come to me in all of your glory." Now, those of you who are church-going know that humans don't look directly at the face of God, and if they do so, it's a terrifying thing, and something that humans couldn't actually take. Well, it's the same for the Romans and the Greeks. Their gods are actually permanently in disguise in some way, shape, or form. We never actually see them the way they really look. Zeus, however, couldn't go back on his word, so he came to Semele in all of his glory, which meant he turned into pure light and nearly evaporated her. Now, Semele was destroyed and was turned into a pile of ashes, but her womb, because she was already pregnant with this child, survived. Zeus sewed up her unborn child into his thigh, and some months later, Dionysus was born from the thigh of Zeus. So Zeus, a god, impregnates a young woman, and with her has a child who is partially born of a woman, but is all God. Story sound familiar to you? And who is Dionysus? Well, let's talk about that. Dionysus is the god of wine. And he comes in a few different forms. We see him here looking like young and beardless. And you can tell it's him because he has clusters of grapes around his head and there are grape leaves. He's holding this stalk called a thyrsus. We'll talk more about that in a minute. He's often seen on a chariot pulled by big cats like these tigers here. And he has followers. We'll talk more about them in a minute. Here are his followers. So the followers with which he's most associated are the Bacchantes or the Maenads. They're often called the Bacchae. And Maenads means mad women. Bacchae and Bacchantes simply mean followers of Bacchus. And how can you tell them when you see them? They're carrying flutes or tambourines. They often walk around with this thyrsus, which is like a stalk of bamboo or fennel with ivy at the top. And sometimes there are snakes crawling on them. And in this version, this depiction of Bacchus or Dionysus, he's actually priestly looking, and he has this long beard and long hair. But you can tell it's him for sure because he has this mixing bowl for wine. Here he is again, holding a thyrsus, and so are his followers, and they have snakes wrapped around their arms. Here the Maenads again, dancing wildly with tambourines and flutes as they worship an idol of Dionysus. One of the things that terrified Romans and Greeks a lot about the worship of Dionysus were rumors about something called sparagmos. It was said that the followers of Dionysus would drink wine and dance around until they came to be in kind of a trance or frenzy. And at this point, it was believed that they would often pick up wild animals and tear them apart, limb from limb. Sometimes it was rabbits, sometimes it was deer. And in the play, The Bacchae, by Euripides, in fact, they actually tear apart a living human being. So what was his worship like? It was secretive and typically out in the woods. This is another thing that disturbed followers. This is another thing that disturbed Romans and Greeks about him. Typically, too, people who practiced this religion or had a leadership role were women. And here the Bacchantes are tearing apart King Pentheus in a scene from Euripides' The Bacchae. There's another group of people that follow Dionysus or Bacchus around. And I say people, but they're not really people. They're actually satyrs. What's a satyr? A satyr is a half-man, half-horse being that typically has the tails and ears of a horse. They also have an erect penis. And what do? They're involved with the grape harvest and dances and the revelry that accompanies it. They're often seen in art chasing Dionysus's female followers around. And there's a lot of really strange art showing satyrs partying down. In Euripides' play The Bacchae, Dionysus actually gives us 7 miracles as a young priest who's coming to liberate his followers by revealing his divine power. He frees his followers from prison. He destroys a palace in Thebes with an earthquake. He gives his followers superhuman strengths. He gives his followers the ability to carry fire on their heads without burning. He makes his followers invincible. He makes people hallucinate. And he pulls a treetop to the ground just by willing it to be so. But what does he represent for us? He represents grapes and their cultivation. He represents drunkenness and the loss of inhibition. He represents nature. And he also represents humanity without the restraints of civilization. There's an element of bliss and violence that's commingled with him in his worship as well, hence the sparagmos. For the Greeks, he was culturally alien, and that is to say he doesn't necessarily come from Greece. In his youth, he actually comes out of the East, from places like Lydia, Phrygia, India, or Bactria. He travels around what we now think of as South Asia. And in truth, wine doesn't actually come from Europe. The earliest grape plants come from South Asia. So there's some truth to the idea that Dionysus and his worship should come from the East. Unlike other Greek gods, he demands recognition. You have to profess your faith for him. He's sexually ambiguous. He's not actually as rough and tough and as manly looking as some of the other Greek gods. And he often confuses the vision. He often presents himself as a bull or a panther. He also represents for the Greeks some sort of epiphany, this realization about the truth or the nature of things for mankind. And it's for this reason amongst many others, that he's so associated with the institution of Greek theater. The Greek hero, after the tragedy and the tragic actions that happen in his play, often have a realization about the way things are. He represents the harshest and greatest in humans, and this includes violence, hence the sporagmos. Greeks and Romans were often afraid that young men were being sexually violated in some way in Dionysus' worship. And that was one of the reasons why his worship was kept underground, and in some cases banned outright. Back to the theater thing. Dionysus, through drinking, allows us to temporarily become someone else. Anyone who's known someone who drinks or drinks too much has probably heard that person say, "Oh, well, that thing I did last night, that wasn't really me." But in truth, Dionysus lets us be someone either who we aren't or someone who we really are but haven't shown the rest of the world. And it's for this reason there's actually this association between him and theater. Actors go on stage and pretend to be someone they're not. He's also connected with Persephone, the goddess of the underworld. He grants people happy afterlife if they follow him in their lives. And he also frequently moves between the upper and lower worlds. He's the only Greek god that I know of who's Greek in a true sense, who grants happy afterlives to his followers. And that's intriguing because the Greek view of the afterlife is kind of grim outside of Dionysus and these other imported gods. Stay tuned for my next lecture on how to take my tests.